Welcome to Bed Crime Stories Podcast. I'm your host, T, and if true crime is your jam and like me, you enjoy delving into unsolved cases, trying to figure out who done it, please consider subscribing. Also, if you enjoy my videos, please hit that like button. Today, I'm going to share what Montello local Kurt Wadsworth, who is a friend of Dylan's and perhaps an intimate partner, although he vehemently denies it, what he said in part 2 of his interview with Salty Pancakes. Because the conversation was driven by subscribers' questions, the topics are a tad disjointed. So I'm just going to state each topic that came up, and then I'll tell you what Kurt said about it. But first, let's review some of the people whose names have come up in association with the case. I'll spare you the names of Dylan Rounds and his family because hopefully you already know who they are. First, 58-year-old Jim Brenner is Dylan's closest neighbor. He lives 5 miles away from Dylan, and his trailer is near the grain shed / workshop where Dylan stored his seed truck when it was raining. Brenner is in custody on unrelated illegal possession of firearms charges. He's a convicted felon with a violent criminal past. He's also been named a suspect in Dylan's disappearance. Brenner and Dylan Rounds sometimes worked together, but they had a power struggle going on over Dylan's permission to store his truck in the shed. Kurt Wadsworth said that Brenner had permission to live on that land in exchange for watching the property. He was not paid to do that. Kurt bought Brenner a horse when Brenner needed transportation. Don Hatley. He's a man who worked for both Dylan and his grandfather. Don lives 6 miles away from Dylan's farm, and he owns about 10 acres of land. Hatley is the guy Dylan's grandmother, Karen Rounds, called when she didn't hear back from Dylan on Saturday. Don also stored firearms for Jim Brenner after Brenner was initially questioned. Next, 38-year-old Robert Aviles lives with his mother in Montello. He moved there after his release from prison. He was arrested on July 4th after failing to appear in court for charges of eluding police in a car where meth and stolen property were found. That occurred in Nevada. Ellen Berg and Kurt Wadsworth have said that Aviles is very good at breaking into people's property and stealing things. Aviles is also believed to have given Chase Venstra a ride to Lucin on the Saturday when Dylan disappeared. Dylan might have been picked up by Aviles in that car on Saturday morning when he was walking back to his farm. 41-year-old Chase Venstra is the person believed to have stumbled out of the desert in Lucin on the Wednesday before Dylan went missing. He too is a convicted felon with a violent criminal past. He's currently incarcerated for being a restricted person in possession of a firearm. It's believed that Robert Aviles drove Venstra out to Lucin on the day Dylan disappeared. Next, Todd Glenn Corbin, who goes by Ty. He's a guy from Nevada who at least at one time owned a small 10-acre homestead. He came into the Dylan Rounds case about a month after the 19-year-old farmer went missing, and he's been doing searches in the desert for Dylan. He's also appeared on No Thanks live panels. Per Kurt Wadsworth, Corbin doesn't know where Dylan's farm is, but he does know where the grain shed is because he worked there one time for a guy named Ed Hirschberger. Kurt has alleged that Corbin is friends with Aviles and Venstra. There's a rumor Corbin is now living with Aviles' mother, but that's just a rumor. Ed Hirschberger is the man who Dylan sometimes worked for and who introduced him to the various land parcels that were available for sale in Lucin when Dylan was looking for a piece of land for his farm. Dylan met Ed through his grandfather, Larry Rounds. Tom Hardy. He's a guy who Kurt Wadsworth said is friends with Ty Corbin, Chase Venstra, and Robert Aviles. According to Kurt, Hardy was in the Saddle Sore bar in Montello, playing the slot machines when Dylan was talking to ranch owner Don Iverson. Iverson is the man who hired Dylan to put in 2 pivots on his ranch, and Dylan earned the $30,000 check from Iverson. Wadsworth speculated recently that perhaps Hardy overheard Dylan and Dan talking about the $30,000 check. Okay, now I'm going to get to my topics. The first topic is the seed truck. This is the truck that Dylan told his grandmother he needed to move on Saturday morning. According to Kurt, Dylan always left the key in the ignition of that truck, and he felt safe doing so because the only person who knows how to drive the truck other than him is Jim Brenner. Dylan had hired Brenner at one point to drive the seed truck to make potato deliveries for 2 months. And I'm assuming that's when Brenner learned how to maneuver the truck. Apparently you have to learn how to start it and drive it. Note that when Brenner was delivering the loads of potatoes, Dylan expected him to do 20 loads a day, but apparently Brenner was only able to do 10, and when he got paid for the work, he was upset because Dylan had subtracted some monies apparently because Brenner failed to make those deliveries. Kurt has said that Brenner, if he wanted to make the full amount, could have done work on the weekends to make up for his lack of the 20 loads every day. So that could have been another source of, upset between Brenner and Dylan. Kurt told Salty that when Dylan's family arrived in Lucin on May 31st to look for Dylan, they hired a tow truck to remove the seed truck from the grain shed. Salty surmised from this that the key must have been missing from the ignition, but I'm wondering if no one in Dylan's family knew how to start and drive the seed truck. Was Brenner there when they were there? I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Salty is probably right though, because Dylan's grandfather, Larry Rounds, is a farmer, and he would almost assuredly have known how to drive that truck. And I believe Brenner might have also been there, so he could have driven it too. Kurt was adamant that Dylan would never remove the key from the ignition, and he would never lock the seed truck because there was no reason to. And that's because Brenner was always there to keep an eye on it because his trailer is near that grain shed. Kurt also said that even if Jim Brenner was pissed that Dylan was parking the seed truck in that shed, Dylan only needed to do that when it was raining. Side note, Kurt says that it isn't actually a grain shed, but rather a shop, as in a workshop. So presumably early on Saturday, May 28th, after calling his grandmother, Dylan drove his seed truck, which was likely parked near his trailer, to the grain shed 5 miles away. Kurt told Salty that Dylan was most likely planting seed throughout Friday night and possibly into Saturday morning. I personally believe this because after Dylan disappeared, his crop began to grow. Someone definitely planted the seed. No pun intended. Kurt Wadsworth has said that a person can drive the seed truck for about 3 hours before it needs to be refilled with seed, so that is likely what Dylan was doing all night. Planting seed for 3 hours, returning to where the seed was to refill the truck, going back to the fields, and so on. Kurt said that Dylan knew it was going to rain on Saturday, and he was determined to plant the seed before the rain came. Note that Kurt said that Dylan was not driving his own tractor Friday night. Instead, he was driving a tractor owned by a man named Randy. I'm not sure what Randy's last name is, so it sounds like the seed truck somehow maybe gets attached to a tractor that pulls the whole thing. I'm not sure. Per Kurt, Randy's tractor doesn't have lights on it, and Kurt was saying that not having lights would have complicated Dylan's work out in the darkness. he wouldn't have been able to see if the seeds were indeed falling out of the cups into the ground or if they were getting jammed and needed to be moved around. I don't know. Kurt thought maybe that's why it all went bad. And by that, he meant that when the seeds started coming up after Dylan disappeared, the family could see that the planting work wasn't really ideal. Topic 2, Dylan's red F-150 truck and the items the family said were missing. As people following the case likely know, Dylan's F-150 truck was found locked and parked near his trailer. Per the family and Kurt Wadsworth, Dylan never locked that truck. So it's likely it wasn't Dylan who locked it. When the family was unable to find the key to the F-150, Dylan's father, who some are telling me now is actually his stepfather, Justin Rounds, I guess eager to see what was in the truck, broke the rear window. Kurt, who was at Dylan's farm when all this was going on, tried to talk Justin out of this, but Justin was apparently determined. Kurt was sure that the key would be found in the trailer because Dylan never took the F-150 key with him when he drove the seed truck. Apparently the key is very large and it's uncomfortable to have it in one's pocket. The family later found the F-150 key inside Dylan's trailer as Kurt had predicted. It was in the pocket of a pair of Dylan's pants. Kurt, who often uses a derogatory term that begins with R for people he thinks are stupid, called Dylan's family a bunch of those for breaking the pricey window. I have to say that Kurt W. has a lot of information, but he uses a lot of not so nice words. His conversation is laced with that R word, and he's also dropped the N word. I also don't like how he disparages gay people, calling them evil and sinners. Whether he's saying this stuff to make people think he's not gay or if he's truly homophobic remains to be seen. This stuff makes me dislike Kurt Wadsworth, but I don't have to like him to listen to what he has to say about Dylan. So in addition to the key to the F-150, the family also found Dylan's Glock pistol in the trailer. There's a rumor that Robert Aviles led the FBI to Dylan's iPhone. If that's true, why would Aviles know where the phone was? So the only article that may truly have been missing on Monday is Dylan's wallet. This to me points to what I personally think is at the crux of Dylan's disappearance, and that is money. Topic 3. Chase Venstra, Robert Aviles, and the theft of firearms. Chase Venstra and Robert Aviles are both convicted felons, which means they cannot legally own firearms. According to Kurt Wadsworth, Chase Venstra stole 2 rifles from people named Michelle and Walt. They are from Logan, Utah, but they have a cabin 1 mile above Kurt's residence in Montello. That's how he described it, 1 mile above his home. 2 weeks after that, Chase and Robert Aviles allegedly ripped off another resident. This time it was a retired man named Jason from Washington State. Jason apparently lives in a 20-foot shipping container with 1 small window and a man door on the side of it. A man door, for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, I wasn't, it's used to describe a side door typically placed next to a garage. Basically, to me, it looks like a door that's cut into the wall of the container and it doesn't have windows. Per Kurt, Venstra and Aviles broke the window and gained access to the house, from which they stole many rifles and pistols and a bulletproof vest. Kurt estimated that it was around 6 rifles and 4 pistols. Now, when the police went to Chase Venstra's house in Utah, Venstra admitted that he had all these guns and said that he'd given them to a friend to hide. When the cops went to the friend's house, they found all the firearms. Now, I was thinking this is Robert Avilas's mother's home, but I'm not sure. Topic 4, why Dylan moved to Lucin. When asked why Dylan moved to Lucin, Kurt said that Dylan never really moved to Lucin, that while he had a trailer out there, he never really lived there full time. He said that Dylan stayed there maybe a couple of days at a time, but then he was out of there and on the road. He often worked on other people's farms, and he needed to go to Rigby, Idaho often to purchase seed and farm equipment. According to Kurt, Dylan wasn't making money on his own farm yet. He said it was a money pit. Instead, Dylan had to go away from his farm to actually make money, meaning the money Dylan was making was from contracting out to other farmers and ranchers. When and why Dylan moved out to Lucin. According to Kurt, Dylan was out in Lucin at age 17, originally working for Ed Hirschberger. Once, for a month, Dylan came out with a travel trailer that he lived in to work for Ed. Per Kurt, there were also about 15 Mexican men living out there, also in travel trailers, and they were driving tractors during that period. It sounds like these may have been illegals who crossed the border for work. While the Mexican men drove the tractors, Dylan worked as a handyman and welder. Apparently, he would drive around in his service truck, fixing trailers when they broke down, jump-starting dead batteries from his truck, and welding things. Kurt Wadsworth was also working in Lucin with his backhoe, which is how he met Dylan. Kurt said he maybe spent a couple of hours with Dylan during that first month-long stay when he drove Dylan to Montello to pick up some steel for welding. Kurt said he'd often watch Dylan welding because Dylan was so good at it. It sounds like Kurt was very impressed by Dylan's skills. One day, Kurt asked Dylan what he was doing there in Lucin. Dylan asked why, and Kurt replied, "Dude, you need to get the hell out of here because this guy doesn't pay very well." Kurt felt that Dylan could be making better money elsewhere. Dylan told Kurt that he wasn't there for the money per se, but instead to pick Ed's brain because Ed knows about all the land out there in Lucin, and Dylan wanted to eventually buy some. Originally, Dylan wanted to start a pig farm, and Lucin seemed to be the perfect place to do that. After that month, Dylan returned to Idaho, and Kurt said he didn't see him again until about 2 years later. So that would have been when Dylan was 18 or 19. So Dylan was not living in Lucin, at least according to Kurt, for 3 years as was previously reported. He really was only out there for an extended period, starting in the fall of 2021. Dylan came back to Lucin at that time to truck aluminum mainline for another guy, maybe Ed, I'm not sure. When Kurt saw him, he was like, "What are you doing back here?" And Dylan said the same thing. "I'm here to pick this guy's brain, and I agreed to come out here to load this pipe in order to learn what the guy knows about the land." At that point, Dylan started talking to a farmer named John Shelton, who owns the property where the grain shed is located. At first, Dylan was going to buy that parcel. However, after he found another parcel that had a well, he convinced his grandfather, Larry, to help him purchase it. Per Kurt, it can cost up to $50,000 to put a well in, so that well was really what drove Dylan to pick that particular parcel for his farm. According to Kurt, Dylan and Larry then bought some equipment for the farm, but a lot of it was leased, and apparently the leased equipment is no longer at the farm, which makes me kind of sad to hear. According to Kurt, Dylan was making a couple $100,000 a year doing work for other farmers and ranchers. Kurt said Dylan made $46 an acre. But Dylan had a lot of expenses too, including fuel, payments on the equipment, seed, etc. Dylan's dream was to eventually get a contract from Budweiser. I believe the brand company name is Anheuser-Busch, and Anheuser-Busch owns many global brands, including Budweiser. Anheuser-Busch often looks for farmers who can grow corn, rice, barley, and hops, and who can deliver it to Idaho Falls or Twin Falls, Idaho. Apparently, those contracts pay really well, and Dylan's dream was to get one. Topic 6: Where Dylan slept and why, according to Kurt Wadsworth. Kurt said Dylan put the trailer out on his farm in Lucin when he moved there in the fall of 2021. Per Kurt, Dylan only lives in the Lucin-Montello area for about a third of the time. During the winter, Dylan heads back to Idaho. According to Kurt, Dylan was working all the time and he just needed a place to sleep in Lucin. He described Dylan's trailer as a piece of caca. Maybe had a microwave, but there was no running water. So that explains another reason why Dylan would prefer to stay in Montello. That arrangement started when Dylan told Kurt that he was going to be putting a main line in for a ranch at a location well beyond Montello. Kurt offered to let Dylan stay in his mobile home in Montello, which was a mobile home that he apparently was not staying in, because then Dylan wouldn't have to drive all the way to Lucin, only to have to drive back through Montello to get to that ranch. After that, Dylan just started staying in the mobile home most of the time because it was a clean place to stay with running water and electricity. Kurt said Dylan would just stay there after that without even asking, and while he never said thank you to Kurt, Kurt knew that he was grateful. Of course, this is Kurt Wadsworth's version of events, so keep that in mind. Topic 7: The Mexican Connection. According to Kurt, when Dylan's grandfather brought a young Mexican guy, who he called a kid, out to Lucin to help Dylan on the farm, Dylan and this Mexican kid stayed together for 3 days in Kurt's mobile home because the Mexican kid did not want to sleep in Dylan's dusty, dirty trailer in Lucin. Per Kurt, Dylan bought pizzas for himself, the Mexican kid, and Kurt, and they ate pizza all 3 nights. The Mexican kid can't speak English, and Dylan apparently can't speak Spanish. Neither can Kurt, so there wasn't much conversation for that poor guy from Mexico. Kurt then posited that maybe this kid has some connection to the Mexican cartel. The kid knows where Dylan's farm is located, so perhaps Kurt thought he could have informed criminals in Mexico. Kurt has also said that Justin Rounds received a call after Dylan went missing, and the people told them that they have Dylan in Mexico and they're going to start doing something to Dylan's fingers. Per Kurt, Justin hung up because he thought it was ludicrous and a fake call. Kurt was angry that Justin didn't take that call seriously. But we've also heard from Candace Cooley that no one has come forward to ask for a ransom for Dylan. So that phone call bit out of Mexico doesn't quite make sense to me. I would like to hear from Justin if they asked him for any money in exchange for Dylan. Note, Kurt has made a point to talk about who knew where Dylan's farm is located. Apparently, if you don't know where that farm is, you would have a really hard time finding it. So if someone targeted Dylan, that person either had to know where Dylan's farm is or where the grain shed is, or both. And only so many people in Montello know where those 2 places are. So in Kurt's mind, whoever harmed Dylan is among those few people. Topic 8: The $30,000 check. Dylan earning the $30,000 check. I previously said it was for $33,000, but Kurt was saying $30,000 this time, so I'm not really sure which of those numbers is correct. Apparently, Dylan got that check from a man named Dan Iverson, who contracted with Dylan to put 2 pivots in on his ranch for him. After Dylan received the check, he drove his seed truck to Rigby, Idaho, to give it to his grandmother. So the arrangement was that Dylan would pay his grandparents back for the money they loaned him to buy the farm. So after handing the check to Karen, Dylan filled his seed truck with seed and drove it back to Lucin. It sounds like Dylan got back to Lucin with the seed around May 24th or May 25th. The seed was waiting in the seed truck at that point for Dylan to plant it. But Dylan couldn't plant the seed until he finished doing work for Dan Iverson. At least that's my understanding, and that's why he was in a mad rush on Friday to plant it. And he would have had to plant well into the night to get the job done before the rain that was forecasted on Saturday would come. And apparently it takes 20 hours to plant all the seed that Dylan had. Topic 9. What Dylan did on Friday, May 28th. Kurt says Dylan was in Montello on Friday morning around 9 or 9:30. He was there because Dan Iverson's pivot broke down, and Dylan made a special trip out to Lucin to get a spare part he had, and that was the part that Iverson needed to fix the pivot. Dylan was about to drive the part out to Iverson's property when he stopped and spoke to Kurt and Kurt's daughter. During that conversation, Dylan tells Kurt that he will need to drive his seed truck to the grain shed on Saturday after he plants all the seed because it's going to rain. Kurt tells Dylan that if he needs a ride back from the grain shed to his farm, to give him a call. Kurt was busy spending time with his daughter that weekend. Otherwise, he would have definitely promised to drive Dylan the 5 miles from the grain shed back to Dylan's farm. Kurt said there's no way Dylan would have wanted to walk those 5 miles in the rain, and obviously that makes sense. If Dylan was planting all night, he would have been exhausted by Saturday morning. And who would want to walk 5 miles in the desert, whether it's raining or not, after spending 20 hours planting seed? That would have been miserable. Dylan told Kurt it would take him about 20 hours to plant all the seed, and that he'd be doing it in the dark now because he'd run out of time. And we know that the seed was planted because the crop came up after Dylan disappeared. So I think we can definitely say that someone, and I would say most likely that was Dylan, planted the seed. I don't see any of the criminal types whose names have come up in the case taking the time to plant all of Dylan's seed and being able to drive the tractor and seed truck if they were trying to hide their crime, except maybe Jim Brenner. Kurt also stated that the seed was poorly planted, and he thought that was because Dylan couldn't see what he was doing. Is it possible someone else planted Dylan's seed? Maybe Brenner? He seems like the only one who could have pulled that off. I think it's possible, but it's probably not likely because, that would have been 20 hours of work if that person planted all that seed. It's just me speculating, but I feel that Dylan probably did plant his own seed. Topic 10. What could have happened? Dylan never called Kurt to give him a ride on Saturday morning. Kurt is theorizing that perhaps someone saw Dylan walking back to his farm and offered him a ride. Kurt was thinking that that person could have been Robert Aviles. Dylan didn't know Aviles, so he wouldn't have been able to look at Aviles and say, oh no, that guy's dangerous, I don't want to get in the car with him. Kurt also thinks that Jim Brenner has to know what happened because he would have seen some of this go down. Kurt, when he spoke to Jim Brenner after Dylan disappeared about where he, Brenner, was on the Saturday, Jim told him that he was at Don Hatley's house from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. However, when Kurt later spoke to Don, Don told him that Brenner was at his house from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. So who's lying, Brenner or Don? I'm thinking it's most likely Brenner, only because he's been called a suspect in Dylan's disappearance and Don hasn't. Note that Kurt thinks it's possible that Brenner, Venstra, Aviles, and he even brought in the name Ty Corbin, could all be involved in Dylan's disappearance. That is just Kurt speculating. No one knows at this point who did what. Could Corbin have turned up in Montello and Lucin to search for Dylan because he's possibly connected to the crime and he wants to throw people off? We know that some perpetrators turn up at searches for their victims. Lacey Peterson's husband Scott is one example. So is this possible? Yes, it is. Some people have also been talking about a phone call that was made to, I believe, John Shelton. He's the guy who owns the land where the grain shed is. Allegedly, Dylan made a call to Shelton that morning, and when Shelton didn't pick up, Dylan left a message. And I believe that Shelton has been unable to get into that message. That's what I've heard. So no one knows what Dylan could have been wanting to say to Shelton. Could Dylan have been calling Shelton to let him know that Jim Brenner was giving him a hard time about getting through the gate so that he could park his seed truck at the grain shed? That's me speculating. I have no idea. It's just a thought I had. Okay, well, that's a lot to drink in. I hope this adds something to your understanding of Dylan Rounds and the people and events surrounding his disappearance. Keep in mind, though, that we can't be sure Kurt Wadsworth is telling the truth. Personally, I'm leaning toward Kurt's version of events. Whether we like the guy or not, whether he really dresses in drag and wears makeup or not, he seems to know a great deal about the people living in and around Montello and Lucin. He also seems genuinely caring about Dylan and that he really wants to find Dylan. Kurt speculated that people like Ty Corbin put out rumors about him being gay in order to distract from whoever may have committed the crime. That's pure speculation. Don't write that down as a fact. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories. Now smash that like button, subscribe if you're not yet subscribed, leave me a comment, and if you want to support my channel and keep the good videos coming, you can do so right down there in the comments.